Business majors, MBAs, and business instructors all know that clear communication is an important business skill. But how important is it? How does clear communication, especially in the form of business writing, come to be? What are some of the best ways to teach this skill? And once this is figured out, how much time should be devoted to writing in the business curriculum? And how might writing be integrated into that curriculum? These are the questions that my guest, Bill Ellet, has worked on for years. Currently, Bill is a full-time lecturer at the University of Miami Business School, teaching a course on critical thinking, writing, and speaking. Preceding that, he taught similar courses at Brandeis University's International Business School and Harvard Business School. He's also published some really useful materials on writing and communication with Harvard Business Publishing, including the Case Study Handbook, as well as an online course on management communication. Bill, thank you for participating in this How I Teach podcast. It's great to have you.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Super. Thank you for being here. Yeah, and let's start off with some basic questions about writing before we get to business writing. You know, we've had some conversations about this, and I loved your first question that you proposed, which is, why is writing hard?
This is something that I talk to my students about because I think the difficulty of writing well is underestimated. Actually, I'm going to say the same thing about reading. Here's some evidence from hardworking anthropologists about our literacy that humans apparently started to communicate in oral language about 30,000 years ago. Now, don't ask me how they know that.
Right.
I don't know, but I've
just
seen
take
that
their
number.
word. Okay.
I've seen that number in a variety of places, so I'm going to trust it. I think we have a much better idea about when we started communicating in written language, and that was about 5,000 years ago. So we have a 25,000 year difference in when we started using spoken language versus written language. And another piece of compelling evidence for me is that, kids learn how to speak by hanging out with humans who know how to speak. They just hang out and they have the circuitry and they pay attention and they start learning at a very young age.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that none of us learns how to write or read by hanging out with literate humans. We have to go to a place called school. So maybe, in 1,000 years, we'll have those circuits. So we'll be able to be self-taught readers and self-taught writers. But for the time being that we're going to be on the face of the earth, that ain't true. So I think that's all evidence that shows that learning how to write, and of course, the complementary skill of reading, is slow and laborious, and that our brains are really not well adapted for it yet. And again, I think we underestimate how hard it is for young people to learn how to write, especially how long it takes, and how hard the reading process is, even for adults. I think we tend to think of reading as effortless, but it isn't. It's effortful. And then when a writer or communicator throws some obstacles in the way of the reader, it becomes even worse. And this is, again, something that I really try to emphasize with my students, especially business school students. I think that writers consistently underestimate the laboriousness of the reading process and the distractions that their audiences are subject to.
I think that second point is very important. The distractions, you got to really contend for their attention.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really a fascinating question. I mean, you're dealing with a set of emotional and cognitive limitations in your readers. That's just how we're wired. That's how we roll. Mm-hmm. But then if you add onto that, the sort of the distraction-rich environment, that readers are in, especially in business, it's really a formidable task. So I call it the attention economy. I think other people, use the same term, and writers underestimate. Writers can be really egotistical, maybe not intentionally, but they assume that if they write something, the readers are going to read it and pay attention to it. But a lot of readers don't. Again, I say to students, when you write something, especially, under any circumstances, but particularly in a business environment, you're making a demand on someone's time. So you better damn well make the best possible use of it.
That's a great way to put it. If you can put people in the sort of the shoes of being in a meeting, right? And people don't want that time to be wasted. It's the same thing for reading a paper or a report or something like that. Yeah,
absolutely. And that principle applies to presentations as well.
That's I think this is a very good point that you're bringing up. And I do like the idea of earning your reader's attention, and the burden is on the writer to do that. All right, so started with the general ideas of writing and why is it hard. So let's narrow this question a little more and say what distinguishes writing from business writing, and so that maybe teachers and students have an idea of what's important about business writing.
Right. Well, I think that that's a big question, and I think it's a hard question to answer. And, you can follow the lead or the paradigm that business writing textbooks often lay out, which is they draw kind of internal genre lines like, oh, there's the memorandum, that timeless, kind of form of writing that's been around for 5,000 years,
Right.
reports and emails. And, and I'm not criticizing them for that. I mean, that's one way of doing it. But that doesn't really help us or students understand the difference between business writing and other uses of writing. I think a place to begin, not that this would be the total answer, is that is defining the purpose of writing.
Well, that's
And
good. That's
most of the
good.
time,
Yeah.
I think business writing has a fairly narrow purpose. And I'm going to give you credit for putting it in very, very simple terms, that business writing often is to facilitate getting things done. Okay. And that applies to business writing and business presentations. Unlike universities where no one has to do anything, businesses actually have to make decisions and do things, or they kind of go under.
Right. That reminds me of somebody told me, if you want to get something done, don't give it to a PhD. Right.
Yeah. Again, they'll do something else with it, but it's not,
Right.
you don't want to run your business that way.
Right.
I don't think. Now, in my mind, that doesn't mean that business writing is always really narrow and, sort of petty practical. It can have expansive purposes, and it can really serve sort of larger issues. Every organization faces challenges that don't just get decided today, that it's
Right.
just about tomorrow or the next day or next week, especially in this day and age. And again, if you're writing, you can't do anything without your audience. So that is, it's almost in a way, your thought, what you're trying to put down in a piece of communication isn't your biggest asset. It's the audience itself. And if you don't take care of them, your ideas don't matter.
Exactly.
Let's put it this way, they're going to have a hell of a lot less impact.
Right.
But I do
Right.
want to go back to your insight about, so that's kind of big picture business writing, which is really appropriate. And again, in the times we live in, it's really, really important. It probably always has been, but given the issues we face and the challenges we face, it's important. But I think in the more kind of mundane but still important, business writing, there are the way I would define it is sort of in three ways. One is clarity of purpose. The second is conciseness. And the third is logical structure. To me, those are the absolute essentials of good kind of real world communication. Those are not just theoretical constructs. Those are things to take care of your audience,
Right.
to sustain, people, be able to help people understand your ideas, and also to keep their attention. And
keep them focused on that goal, whatever it
right,
is.
exactly. So clarity of purpose is pretty straightforward. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve in a piece of writing, you almost certainly won't achieve it. And I think a lot of people kind of plunge into a communication, a piece of writing, and they're not really sure what they're trying to achieve. And that's fine, as long as they ultimately realize what they're trying to achieve and then kind of shape and structure the communication to sort of facilitate that, to achieve it. And again, it may be easier to sort of think about that in terms of presentations that you've witnessed, where the speaker is kind of all over the place, and you can see rapidly what happens is that people just can't figure it out and they stop listening. They're staring at their phones, things like that. Conciseness, as I said, reading is effortful and audiences have limited attention spans. and that the limited attention spans are actually part of the circuitry of our brains. And there's a good reason for that. But, gets in the way of our attempts to kind of connect with people. So I think that, again, conciseness, you're working against these kind of attentional circuits. Also, throwing large amounts of information at your audience that they won't remember is self-defeating, for a writer or a presenter. So just to sum up, conciseness is a discipline in my mind of delivery, of delivering the content you want your readers to remember. So first thing, what is my purpose? And then second, what is the sort of content that I want them to remember? Mm-hmm. And the content that's superfluous, I'm going to exclude. And then finally, logical structure. You need to create a logical structure to guide your readers through your thinking. And that's critical in two ways: to facilitate their understanding and to hold their attention. Again, I keep coming back to this. Yes, comprehension is really important, but you're working in two dimensions. You want them to understand that, the flow of thinking that you're, offering to them, but you also want to make it easy for them to stay focused on it.
Okay, so moving to more specific questions about business programs and writing, and if you look across curricula, there is in all sorts of schools, there's nobody follows one way of dealing with business writing. Sometimes it's not given much attention in business programs. Why is that, and why is it important in a business curriculum?
So that's a good question. My answer to it is probably, it's controversial. It could be controversial. I just think most academic curricula is conservative and reluctant to include ideas from what they view as being outside the discipline. Mm-hmm. A very recent example of this is how all of a sudden sustainability is hot in business programs, but that has only been very, very recently. The issue has been out there for a long time. Writing is different. It's not the subject du jour. It's been a part of the educational curriculum since before universities were established. But I think that business schools have been resistant to teaching things like writing because they see it as a non-specialist course. It's, the liberal arts course, they let it in, it's going to dilute their kind of specialist brand. I can't prove that, but I've certainly run into that attitude over the years that I've been teaching in business schools. And I just personally, and I'm not trying to say this, I hope it doesn't sound self-pitying, but, in an attempt to teach writing and presentations, in a business school, I've often felt like an outsider, because we all know that the core of a business curriculum is finance and accounting. I mean, these so-called hard, disciplines. And to me, that is really short-sighted because, as I said earlier, it takes a long time for people to learn how to communicate effectively. The time span that people need to do that, it can be shorter for some, but much longer for others. So that means a lot of students, they get to business school, they're not particularly good writers. Let's put it this way: the people in the real world are much more likely to immediately acknowledge the importance of communication as opposed to academics in business schools.
Understood.
I've heard this, this executive who was head of this huge corporation was giving a presentation to some business school students, and he said, and he brought up this topic, and he said, so I actually had I can think of a hiring decision I had to make in the past where we had one person who was brilliant, at his specialty, but he had no clue how to communicate his thinking to other humans, or maybe didn't feel the necessity to do it because it was all supposed to be obvious.
Right.
And then I had another candidate who was clearly not as adept or skilled in that particular specialty, but she was a great communicator. And he said, who do you think I hired? I hired the communicator, because those brilliant ideas bottled up in that person's head, they may be great, but they're of no use. Again, to use your insight, Mark, If it isn't useful to getting things done, it's not useful.
Okay, so getting down to specific kinds of writing, maybe they're writing case exams, maybe it's a research paper or planning a presentation, Um, and so I'm getting in the shoes of teachers
Hmm.
who, teach operations, teach whatever. They realize their students need some help. They're not writing teachers, but maybe they do have some sensitivity to this issue. What do they need to make sure their students understand when they're tackling one of these more business-oriented kinds of writing tasks?
Well, I would encourage teachers to assign writing and presentations in their classes. I would strongly encourage them, and many, many business professors do that. Um, yes, it's more work for teachers. Lecturing is much easier
Right.
because it's all pretty much one-way communication until the high-stakes exam comes along. But all those activities are invaluable to students. But I have to just be honest. I have to be, frank. Instructors who do this have to make a decision. Are they going to use these assignments simply to test what students know, or at that moment at least, or are they going to use them as vehicles for learning? And if it's the latter, a learning experience, they have to make a commitment to their students, writers and presenters, to give some kind of meaningful feedback.
Mm.
All right. And I totally get why a lot of instructors are not going to make that commitment. Say they're teaching 4 or 5 classes, they have a ton of students, they're at a community college or a 4-year state university, they have just huge classes. It's really, really time consuming.
Mm.
But I would say that if those professors in business who are in a more favorable sort of instructional situation, it just adds a tremendous amount of value to the class, and not just because the students are they're advancing their communication skills, they're actually going to learn the content better.
Right.
I think
Right.
that's
Absolutely.
there's a lot of research about active learning that it's much more effective in the long term than passive learning. So I'd like to give a little specific advice. I mean, you asked a good question. What should these instructors who are brave enough to incorporate some kind of communication, work into their courses? What should students know? Now, of course, that's a vast question, and so I would like to narrow it down. Students need to understand the assignment, of course, but they also need to understand the evaluation criteria um, that professors are going to use. And that's not just so they can get a good grade. They just need to understand what the professor's looking for,
Mm-hmm.
what the professor's expectations are. So it's fair. It's also part of a learning process for them. And I think then that every professor or instructor should provide, meaningful criteria to students before the assignment, when they hand out the assignment. This is going to sound strange, but I also would like teachers to think about sometimes allowing students to pick their own topics for assignments,
Mm-hmm.
especially for presentations. And I think so, topics imposed by the teacher often lead to really listless kind of efforts, and understandably. Um, this is the students aren't necessarily interested in the topic. They're doing
Right.
it because it's basically been imposed on them. So you're probably not going to get a lot of enthusiasm. Um, and then on top of that, if all the students say are doing a presentation on the same topic, you can be absolutely sure that virtually no one in that class is listening. And the presenters are well aware of that. So there's no energy, none. It's kind of like everybody's going through the motions. I don't see how that's worthwhile for anybody. A few years ago, I decided, okay, so I was, having people do presentations based on a case we've discussed in class.
Right.
And that's better than just, a 1-paragraph assignment that the professor imposes, because you can get different points of view. But I just said, this is all it's tedious for me. It's tedious for them. We keep hearing a presentation on the same thing over and over and over again. What else? What can I do? Now I have a little bit of luxury because I teach a communication course. And I said, okay. So I stopped a few years ago and said, all right, you can present on anything you want. My one requirement is that it be meaningful to you in some way or another. And they're sort of staring at me going, Huh? Can I present on an animal shelter that I really believe in and why, it's important to don't go to puppy mills, go to animal shelters? I said, yeah, fine. And they just were shocked because, this is a business class. All I can say is that over the last 3 or 4 years, I've noticed that the improvement in skills in terms of presenting in particular has been much better than it used to be because
Mm-hmm.
students have more invested in it. They want to get up, they want to make an impression on their audience. I've had student groups stand up and give a standing ovation to a presenter, just because they were so moved by, what their presenter was saying. Anyway, the final assignment I have is to have them work in teams and come up with a business idea. And they have to give a presentation and then a sort of a short kind of written pitch. So this is a little bit more confined than the just kind of open-ended, or broad assignment, present anything you want. But again, it's their idea. It doesn't always work, but it's their idea, and they really want to persuade the people in the room that this is a viable business. I don't make
Mm-hmm.
it into a finance assignment. It's just like, I want you to convince the people in the room that this could really work.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I just see much higher level of enthusiasm and a better performance.
So that deals with what I like to call upstream issues, about motivation and focus, right? To maintain their focus and attention on what they're presenting. How about the other way around on the end? Let's say the downstream. The professors get papers and see mistakes, see problems with them. I wonder if you could talk about like 2 or 3 typical problems you've run into, maybe from business students, and even if it's a Band-Aid, any remedies or responses that you might have to those kind of problems that you see in written assignments.
This is a dangerous question to ask me because I could go on and on and on.
That's why I said 2 or 3.
Right, I know, and violate all the rules that we've been talking about.
Exactly.
So one thing I think that a lot of business school professors in particular face is the issue of non-native English speakers.
Mm.
And if you're going to require some writing, some of the, again, I think that the level of, written English skills among foreign students has improved dramatically over the last 20 years, but there's still plenty of students who struggle. And
Right.
These are really tough to deal with because, business professors are busy enough, and then they're confronted with students who have some serious grammar, stylistic issues. And I'm not, so my strong advice is send these students immediately to the Campus Writing Center. Okay. There are some great people there. I've seen this at Brandeis. I've seen this at University of Miami. That's what these centers are really equipped to do. And they're patient, and, students can learn, potentially they can learn enough to create a much better kind of written product. So again, I wouldn't expect, business professors sit down and correct multiple grammar errors. They should, because that's what those writing centers are about. So I guess a few other things, a real weakness in native English speakers often is that they have learned how to operate the great fluff machine on college writing assignments. So in college, they're assigned a 10-page paper and they have 5 pages of thought. And that's a problem because the professor is going to get the paper and immediately flip to the back to see how many pages and mark them down. So these students learn how to cope with the system. They learn how to inflate their papers. And then they get a good grade on the paper and therefore are indoctrinated into the great fluff machine. Fluff is good.
And did they get the good grade because the professor's mainly looking for page length and not really looking very closely at the argument?
I think yes, there's that. And then the professors are also looking for sort of ideas. They don't care about the writing that much. They have to plow through the writing. So they don't feel like it's their job. And maybe it isn't to give, feedback on the writing. The problem is that, it gives this wrong impression to students. So once they get out there in the real world, as we've been talking about earlier, and their boss sees their writing and they're just, A lot of companies now are requiring writing samples
Oh,
from,
really? I
yes,
didn't know
from
that.
business
Oh,
school students who are looking for a job. And I don't know how seriously they take them, but the fact that they're asking for them means that they take it with some kind of seriousness. They
right.
understand that people who can't express themselves introduce this inefficiency into organizations that's really can be damaging. Again, this is going to seem maybe not worthy, not adequate to the problem, but I think that professors can help by stressing conciseness. That is defeating the great fluff machine. And also, not inviting fluff by not assigning really long papers or giving assignments with flexible lengths. Say, okay, minimum 5 pages, because I think that's what you need to, make the case for this or give an adequate analysis, and
Hmm.
up to 10, between 5 and 10. Okay. And then I'm going to judge how persuasive and convincing and analytical you are in however many pages you submit to me.
That's a great idea, by the way. That's a great idea. Do you have any other insights about assignments? That was like, assignments that sort of cut off the writing problem before they start, I guess, right?
So if I really had effective answers to that question, I would be such a wealthy person, and I would be sitting in the Keys right now. Um, you know, One thing I can think of off the top of my head, and it's just because this is kind of something I've done without really thinking about it in the way you suggested, is that, so I love using cases for writing assignments in any course that I teach. And what I try to focus the students on is, I want you to, whatever the major issue of the case is, I want you to state a conclusion about that and then prove it. Okay. Don't give me a summary of the case.
Right.
Do not just, parade all this kind of undifferentiated evidence in front of me. State the conclusion and as efficiently as you possibly can, prove it. And that provides, and I know a lot of professors, and not just writing professors, use that, approach too. Um, that really tends to kind of limit the risk of students, and you've seen this, the classic mistake on case-based exams is students don't know what to do, so they basically repeat what they think are the key case facts, but they're not attached to any particular point of view.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. They
you
just
can
fill
say,
in
listen,
space, right?
I'm your professor. Imagine I'm an impatient boss. We are facing this issue as described in the case. You need to, as efficiently as possible, state your conclusion and prove it. And prove it means you offer solid reasons and absolutely the most compelling evidence you can to support those reasons.
My corollary to that would be I tell them that it's a leadership communication exercise,
Right.
and so you're in front of a board, you need to persuade them, you've got 20 minutes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, I mean, I think that's great. That's great advice because, I've heard countless stories about the shock that some young people have. They actually get into the C-suite to give a presentation or to, go, they've written a memo and then they're going to they're going to sort of pitch it in presentations. And the C-suite people are rude. They say, okay, no, I don't want to know that. I don't want to know that. Just what do you think and why do you think it? And it can be a real shock.
Oh, yes, especially when it comes with that kind of authority
Right.
on over
Right.
their
You see your
job.
whole career flashing
Right.
before your I'm done before I'm
Exactly.
even gotten started.
Right, right. One other corollary to thinking about assignments, what do you think about a pre-matriculation course? Would that be helpful? Say, like, 2 weeks spent on writing. Would that be helpful, or is that not enough?
Well, first of all, I think any pre-matriculation work can be really helpful. And those seem to have fallen out of favor. Now, I taught in a pre-matriculation course that was
Hmm.
focused on case discussion, skills, and writing. No presenting, just writing, because that kind of matched up with the curriculum. It was at Harvard Business School.
Hmm.
And it was one of the best teaching experiences I've ever had. The improvement that I saw in a pre-matriculation course on the writing side was phenomenal. Very few of them ever ended up in academic trouble.
Mm.
Um, and and by anecdotally, I heard that these students went into the case classroom for, case discussion, even though their English may not have been as powerful as some of their peers, they had so much more confidence.
Mm.
It was really a great success all the way around. My impression is that a lot of business schools they're not devoting those resources anymore to that. There's sort of more emphasis on getting them in and then getting them out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's not a core function,
Right.
sort of. Right. How about devoting an entire course to writing? I mean, obviously, that is not the trend, right? As you're telling me, but would that be useful?
Well, I think it's not a trend necessarily, but it's a mixed sort of thing. I mean, you got some, many business schools who do devote significant resources to courses on writing or presenting or both, and many who do not. Of course, I'm a strong advocate of writing courses in business schools because that's what I do. But honestly, the greatest value of a writing course isn't in the syllabus. That's what professors like to think, but it's not.
Mm.
It's in iterative practice and feedback. So that really is it. And I think that applies to all kinds of skills. Obviously, again, the feedback needs to be, on point and meaningful to the individual student. But in some ways, it really doesn't matter what the syllabus is. So my bias is, again, that practice and then getting the feedback that matters. Now, another reason why, these writing courses I don't think are very common in business schools, because that means the school has to invest a lot of, instructor hours,
right,
in feedback. So they can't have gigantic classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they make the wrong decision in saying, no, we want to do that.
It reminds me, one approach I've used in the past in classes is to start before feedback happens. I give out old papers, of course they're anonymous, A, B, and C, and we'll discuss, why is this an A, why is this a B, why is this C, and then we, if people have disagreements, it's not attached to their work, right? Because a lot of times that can be a lot more either scary or provocative. Why did you give me a B minus? But if we look at a paper that deserved a B minus and we come to a consensus, it's a lot easier to grade that way, and it's less seen as a sort of punitive thing, and more like, hey, we already understand why this is B minus. We can talk more about it, but
Right.
you and I have already agreed in general about why this deserves a grade like this.
Yeah, no, I think that I've done that many times too. I mean, I don't do it enough, actually. Put up, 2 or 3 examples of a writing assignment, and anonymous. And I make it absolutely, clear to students in the room if this is your paper, you do not have to identify yourself as the
Right.
author. You cannot comment in the third person, however. Can't do that. Then I challenge the students, it's okay, what's positive about this piece of writing and why? And what could be improved? Because what I have found is that students are much more prone to be critical in a negative way than to recognize the strengths of a piece of writing. They jump right on, oh, look at that, look at that, look at that. It's like, okay, that's legitimate. Let's take a step back, though, and recognize what this author does well, because you need to be able to evaluate your strengths and weaknesses.
One last question about specific kinds of writing. So if we get out of the business school classroom and people are looking forward to, the things they have to do at work, maybe emails might be a good thing to think about. I wonder if there's any advice you'd give about a specific kind of writing.
Yeah, well, probably the overwhelming amount of writing that people in business do now is emails. The only advice I have to give, the best advice I get, would be to reiterate some things that I mentioned earlier that we discussed, which is clarity of purpose, conciseness, and logical structure. Those kind of fundamental attributes of good, business writing, they apply whether you're writing a memo or an email. And it's tragic, I think, with people who are not disciplined. They don't respect their audience's time. They dash off long, emails, and they basically say to the audience, you figure it out. And nobody's listening to them, so their voice is being diminished because they see who it's from. They read the first two sentences and they can't figure out what the email's about, and they just ignore it. Unless it's a CEO, of course.
Right.
So
Right.
I just want, clarity of purpose. Your email reader audience should know why you're writing them in the shortest possible time. They should know immediately what it is, because until you tell them, they can't understand anything they can't understand what you're saying.
Well, I also think that people are tolerant and accepting of a detailed response when they know what the details are attached to.
Right.
The point.
Right.
It's okay if this point is really important. I'll listen for 5 minutes.
Right.
But if they don't know that point's important, then you lose them.
No, that's exactly right. We literally can't. As soon as we start reading, we're trying to create kind of a logical structure, a logical frame in which to understand this thought that's coming at us. And until we know what kind of the main idea is, we can't really create that kind of structure. We have to keep looking for it. So besides clarity, purpose, and conciseness and logical structure, I would add one more thing, and that would be evidence. If you're trying to prove something, say you're recommending a decision to your team, first of all, the team needs to know, what are you recommending? And that would be, I always say, put it in the first paragraph. If you put the conclusion at the end, what happens? Well, people go searching for it, and then they have to go back and reread. So you're making them read your thing twice, if you're lucky. Anyway, so you're trying to recommend a decision to the team. You need sound reasons and supportive evidence. And when I say evidence, that, there's a risk there, because a lot of people see evidence as like as many numbers as you possibly can throw up on the screen or put it on a piece of paper. And actually what the evidence shows is that you should limit yourself to the most compelling evidence you have. Because if you overwhelm the audience with evidence, first of all, you risk inattention, but that actually ironically ends up diluting the impact of the most powerful evidence you have. So if you have, 3 pieces, you have 3 points of evidence to support, a reason, but you put 10 in there, you've just taken away the potential impact, or, the potential impact of those 3 great pieces of evidence.
So we started out with a big question, which I thought was really interesting. Why is writing hard? And you took us to some areas that I did not expect and really enjoyed. Let's get back and maybe end with a big question related to some of your experience, especially, say, at Harvard Business School, where, leadership is such the emphasis, and rightly so. It's a very important element of any business career. What is the relationship between leadership and communication, or leadership and writing?
Well, again, I could blab on about this topic for a very long time because I have some pretty strong feelings about it. I'll try not to be too verbose, but I think there is incredibly strong connection between leadership and communication. And communication, again, broadly defined, it could be writing, it could be presenting, it could be other, kind of other venues, meetings, things like that. I mean, now, the importance of communication to leadership does depend on how power is distributed in an organization. So if you're in a top-down organization, communication, I don't think, is really that critical, because you're just telling the subordinates what they're supposed to do. And there are plenty of organizations out there that are still operated in that way, even though, all the literature would have us believe otherwise. But the thing is, now that is becoming a really difficult model to sustain, because in modern organizations, bosses often don't have enough knowledge to do what their subordinates do, and they can't give them reliable orders about what they should do. So they have to do other things like set goals and objectives, not telling professionals how they're supposed to do their job. So the bosses need to lead, in other words. I'm not going to tell you how to do your specific duties, but I'm going to create a kind of leadership framework. Here's what we need to do. Here's why. I'm not going to compel you to do it. I'm going to persuade you that these are worthwhile things to do. So here's an example of what I mean about sort of differentiating between leadership and communication and actually, sort of the professional work that supports it. So in a university development division, I'm sorry, they needed some meaningful data to make good decisions about targeting the highest potential donors to the university. Now, it's sort of strange that they weren't doing that, but they wanted to get better at it. But the leaders of the development decision, they weren't experts in the database and the dashboarding software that they were using, that the university was using. So they needed to be able to tell the professionals what information would be most useful for them, and solicit suggestions about what other data might reside in the database that could be useful to them, and then work with the IT professionals to get the dashboard display that would be, in the end, the most helpful to them.
Okay.
So that's kind of it's an organization in which knowledge and power is distributed more evenly, but the leadership, they're still leaders, and they need to be, they need to make a compelling case to the professionals. Look, this is invaluable information, and this is how it's going to help us grow, the endowment for the university, which benefits everybody. Again, to me, that's a good example of how leadership and communication sort of intersect in a modern organization.
And I think your point, I just want to add, I think your point about the leaders not knowing a lot about what their subordinates are doing, you really have to then invite their expertise. You can't suss it out. You really have to, right.
No, that's exactly right. And there's another aspect of this too in organizations, which is that when you think about it, bosses can't accomplish anything on their own. So most leaders these days have to know how to enlist the support and commitment of their employees to achieve key goals. And for that to happen, for them to be effective, they really do need superior communication skills. And I would also add the flexibility to understand that, they're trying to persuade people, and that is an iterative back and forth process.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for these insights. From beginning to end, I've learned a lot today, and hope I can apply this whenever I have the occasion and the privilege of having students to teach.
Again, I want to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I really do appreciate it. And thank you so much for your great questions.